All right, welcome to this sped up version of a live broadcast where I finish off this large 11 by 17 scene. All right, now what we're doing here is I've already applied my dye-based inks and I'm going in with some alcohol pens to get a little bit more kind of detailed in terms of my application of tone and hue and things like shadows, okay? One of the good things about alcohol pens is they come in so many different incarnations of each hue. For example, we have light grays, dark grays, medium grays, warm grays, cool grays, etc. Right here I'm applying some of this ink over the tops of my rocks, and I don't know, for some reason it seems to be removing some of the dye-based ink, so I'm using it for that illumination effect. I'm going into some of these mountains here and applying a very light tone, and it's putting back into solution some of the other colors of ink that I've already laid down, but I don't know, I think it might be removing some of the dye-based inks as well. This is a glossy cardstock, and dye-based inks work by staining, but for some reason I think that some of this alcohol ink is almost acting like a, I wouldn't say it's bleaching it, but it does seem to be removing a little bit. So I was able to use some of those pens for kind of a little bit of lighting by the removal of some ink. Okay, now I'm making a bold move here with some, not some, but a 3mm white acrylic paint pen. And I'm going into the water area, clouds here, areas where there is a lighter area because of the absence of media or additional tone that was applied in the form of the dye-based inks and the alcohol inks, okay? So I'm applying light kind of highlights in light areas, all right? I'm not applying this very large 3mm acrylic paint mark to darker areas. It would just stand out too much. Now, that little area in the clouds that I just applied it to, kind of in that upper left-hand corner, that was almost too much, but I'm not really worried about that because I do go back in with some white pigment ink at the end of this, all of my processes, and it blends it all in. Okay, now this one right here is the 0.7 extra fine acrylic paint pen, so I'm able to do a lot of detailed areas here. And the marks could be fairly bold, you know, it can really stand out if I apply it in or over a dark object or area. But for the most part, I'm applying this white into some light areas. Okay, now I'm using a very light blue pen here for the areas that are a little bit darker where the white would just stand out a little bit too much. One good you know, the good things about paint pens these days is when they come in these sets, they come in so many different values of each hue. So you can have a really good selection, so you don't have to always just stick with white. And I usually apply the same colors that I utilize in my dye-based inks and alcohol pens with the paint pens. Okay, so everything's kind of in harmony with each other because they're similar tones, just different mediums. Okay, going into my rocks here, making the rocks seem a little bit more three-dimensional with those highlights like this. I can bring in light where maybe none or very little of it existed, okay, in the form of highlights, or, you know, you can do very bold lighting too if you wanted to, but I usually keep it a little bit more subtle with, you know, kind of smaller applications. Okay, now I'm applying a little bit of highlights on some of those peaks. Now on these trees here in the foreground, I'm applying highlights on the right side of them, okay? Because that's where the lighting is coming from within that space. It's kind of reflecting off that water. So on these trees, to the left of that water, and thus light, I'm illuminating the right-hand side of them. Okay, and you'll see me do the opposite on the other trees. Okay, these are the trees that are off to the right. The light is coming from the left, so the trees are being illuminated on the left with this white paint pen. Okay, so you can kind of reiterate your lighting. You can get some extra texture on your objects. And it just, I don't know, it just makes the scene a little bit more, I don't know, I guess three-dimensional. Okay, so you see some of those areas on those mountain peaks. Putting a little bit of highlight. You got to be careful when you apply some of that white down there. Like I said, you can go with a darker color, but kind of don't overdo it. I was telling my viewers to hold your scenes at an arm's distance to get a good overview of how things are looking. Okay, white pigment ink. This is the element that tends to blend everything together if I don't apply my dye-based inks or alcohol inks or alcohol markers very well. Paint pen, highlights. This white pigment ink application on a cotton ball all brings it together, okay? It emphasizes certain things, but it can also de-emphasize things by putting things in back of a kind of a veil of, I don't know, mist or something like that, fog. Okay, now I'm applying it into those clouds below the mountains, the clouds above the mountains. Now I'm applying it to my water area where the shoreline is. And also I'm applying it in some of those areas of those trees. Right above the Lakeside Cove images, the pines and rocks. And now I'm applying it down here into my water. You don't really see it too much around in that water because there's not so much contrast between that application of the white in a very dry brushing kind of method. If you haven't done this type of technique before, what you're doing is you're doing a dry brush type of technique. Everyone, I would say 99% of the people that try this for the first time, kind of going for a misty effect, every time I do this, I always mention you have to do it where you barely apply any ink, but it's a learning curve. No one listens to that, so everyone applies like 20 times more ink in their applications than they should. And they say, oh my gosh, it's this big blob of ink that they're applying instead of this kind of real thin veil of mist. Okay, so just really dry it off. You want it to where you almost can't see anything until you tap, your cotton ball down about 10 times, and then, it starts to appear. I mean, you can do it faster than that, but I'm talking about when you're kind of initially getting the feel of this. People don't do that because when they apply such a very, very thin layer of any type of media and you can't see it, they think it's completely dry and they need to ink it up, so they ink it up and they get these big blobs when it comes to this type of technique. But just make it an easy technique by making an easy process by making that application of that pigment ink a very dry one. Alright, making some light beams here, and again I'm just doing some very dry applications of this pigment ink, so it goes on very kind of almost transparent or into translucent. Okay, I don't want these beams to be so stark white, and very, very opaque. I want them to, to be able to be read, but I want the images behind these beams to also read through each beam. So and also I just didn't want those beams to just overpower the entire scene, so making them kind of faint here. And one of the things about pigment ink is it dries a little bit more transparent than what it looks like when it's been freshly applied. So as I talked with my viewers in the chat, as they were watching this, this scene started to dry, and I felt the beams looked even more integrated when they dried and looked, more see-through. They look darker. Okay. Now, one of the things I'm doing is with my pen here, I'm going back and kind of in the path of those beams, I'm illuminating the trees within that beam. So it's something that it's kind of fun to do. You don't always have to do it, but it just kind of reiterates that light beam kind of hitting those trees. And that's what I'm doing here too. See that very faint light beam, or those very faint light beams, I'm just kind of illuminating the tree where those beams are hitting the trees. Okay? And that is pretty much it. We're adding in some more texture into this water. I thought the water became a little bit boring, even though we do have some good textures and color changes happening throughout there. Never hurts to have a little bit of extra texture in there, and it makes the water seem a little bit more, you know, clear and transparent and kind of welcoming as a result. Okay. All right, so this entire finishing video is kind of condensing, you know, about 2 hours worth of, I don't know, finishing kind of detail work into about 11 minutes. Just stamped those little birds in there. It needed something live in this scene, and I'm kind of toning out some of those birds that are a little bit smaller in the distance, so it looks, you know, we get a little bit of depth within that little object of those birds. Okay, hope you enjoyed this. Thanks so much for watching.